Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, FinCyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Communications Officer here at FS-ISAC. Today's guest is Ariel Weintraub, the CISO of life insurance firm MassMutual and member of FS-ISAC's board of directors. Before her current job, she held strategic security roles at TIAA and BNY Mellon. Ariel is deeply passionate about bringing more diversity into the cyber talent pool and sits on the boards of the Executive Women's Forum and the ISACA One in Tech Foundation. Thanks for being here today, Ariel. I'd like to start with a topic that both of us care a lot about, which is workforce development and specifically bringing more diversity into the cybersecurity talent pool. In the work that we have been doing in FS-ISAC, I often build the business case for diversity. Like, the threat actors are a very diverse crowd, so we need a lot of different experiences to be able to stay ahead of them. And obviously that the talent shortage is so acute that we just need to invest in growing a bigger pool than we currently have. Tell me a little bit about why you're so passionate about it.
I think those two things are definitely the key drivers for me, especially the fact that we continue to see a lot of competition for talent across the market. I think the pandemic has further exacerbated that challenge where a lot of companies that were more geographically centralized are now open to um, talent recruiting in different areas, and so it just makes the competition even more challenging. And so creating an opportunity for more people to enter the market, for some people that may have not previously had either the educational opportunities or the means to get into cybersecurity, I think are a large untapped population of people that bring unique experiences. And so that's just one, I think, of the many reasons that it's important. And I'm very passionate about continuing to look for ways to tap into some of those, underrepresented communities. And again, coming back to the education, where there's the ability to help encourage those that maybe wouldn't have been able to go to a 4-year school, um, provide financial scholarships to them to create additional opportunities. And then I think the other side of that is being creative about the background, the educational backgrounds that we recruit from within cybersecurity. So historically, I think all the roles have been targeted towards computer science or technical oriented degrees. And what we've seen is that a lot of people coming from other educational backgrounds, finance, economics, political science, they bring another unique perspective to the table. And so we can increase our diversity representation just knowing that we also have more diversity in some of those degrees that maybe historically we haven't been recruiting from.
Can you talk about some of the efforts, like the specific efforts that you're involved in, and what is it about them that you think works?
Sure. On in my day job, we have a big emphasis on talent and development as part of our a strategic program. So that means that we're investing in not only the retention of our existing team members, but also heavily recruiting in our new early in career space and creating a new rotational program for creating additional opportunities for people to enter into the industry. And I think that has been really successful, especially for creating opportunities for those of diverse backgrounds, because what we find is that cybersecurity can be hard to enter when you don't have the initial experience. If you look out there if you look at job descriptions that are out there, there's very few that are actually posted at the early career level where you need zero experience. And so it's very hard to get your foot in the door and start. And so we find that to be a really important factor for tackling this problem. So we have at MassMutual now a formal rotation program where, again, we're hiring first as interns, and then after their internship, if we extend them an offer full time, they're entering a rotation program, which gives them experience in a couple of different areas before they decide where they want to land full time. Outside of my day job, I sit on another nonprofit board called One in Tech, which is a foundation of ISACA. and their mission is to increase the representation of women and diversity in technology and cybersecurity. And they have some similar missions as we've just talked about. And this past year, they've launched a scholarship program as well. And that's as mentioned before, a really great way to provide financial opportunities for those that might not have thought they had the opportunity to attend college. And so continuing to do things that create additional talent pools for the market.
I have some experience in working with under disadvantaged populations and getting them into tech. One of the challenges that I found is there's a big difference between, I think, people who have some skills that then they could build on, but then they don't have the economic or, scholastic opportunities, academic opportunities to fulfill that, versus, really people who have been educationally disadvantaged to a point where the investment to get them to the place where they could actually, become productive members of the team in any kind of, couple of years time frame is hard. So at what place do you see, or what kind of intervention point do you see is the most effective for kind of giving the people who could do it the opportunity, but also like there's a finite amount of resources to be able to train people up? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's looking for the specific qualities that you can't teach versus identifying
Mm.
what areas could be easily taught. So, one example of that is what we
Mm.
refer to as intellectual curiosity. You can't really teach someone to be looking on their own to solve problems and to teach themselves and to be a self-starter. That's just something that is innate to the person. And so if you find someone with
Mm.
that quality, but maybe they've not had a formal educational background or they didn't have other opportunities that gave them access to other resources, those are things that can be more easily taught, whether that be the
Mm.
technical skills or even soft skills. A lot of companies have a wide variety of educational opportunities internally for um, on all ranges, whether that be for particular technical training for hands-on job work, or whether that be how to navigate difficult situations or increase your
Mm.
ability to deliver effective presentations. So I think differentiating between what you can teach and what is just part of that human being is important for differentiating.
And then have you kind of like intellectual curiosity, for example, have you then designated some of those skills that you can't teach and how you can find those skills in people?
That's a good question. I think the initial conversation that we have with someone, whether that be through a formal interview or in just the initial interactions that we have, I think says a lot about the person and their desire to learn and their desire to be part of the workforce. I can think of one person in particular that I met when he was an intern, and he was actually an intern in a different area of the company and was interested in pursuing a full-time role in cybersecurity. And I was incredibly impressed by my first interaction with him because he came very prepared to the conversation. He knew nothing about cybersecurity. He knew nothing really about IT actually in general, but he came prepared with really thoughtful questions and guided the conversation versus it being the other way around, which is a bit of a pet peeve of mine when I meet with people that ask to be mentored or people that have an interest in talking about, how do I get into cybersecurity? And I find that the conversation is more me driving the conversation versus the other way around. And so I think you get a good
Mm.
indication pretty early on from the person about their interest and their drive. And I personally don't think that has anything to do with their education or their background. They
Yeah,
might not
for sure.
necessarily have all the technical skills. They might not maybe even speak as effectively as others, but that doesn't take away from their drive and their ability to be a self-starter.
Yeah, agreed. So you mentioned the kind of competition for talent these days and the great resignation and all of that. How much effort do you have to put into retaining the talent that you have?
A lot. And there's so many factors that go into somebody deciding to stay at the company. We've recently done a stay survey so that we can identify. We
Mm.
do a pretty good job when somebody leaves of asking questions of, why did you leave? But historically, haven't necessarily taken the time to ask people why are you still here? What's important to you? What should we continue to do that we're doing well? And then the questions of, well, what would make you take that call? What would you consider? What would make you consider take that other opportunity? And what we found is that, there's the obvious answers like compensation, of course, but then there's some of the more intangibles that are really as equally important as your compensation or your total compensation package. And those things are things like giving development opportunities to learn and do new things. We have a lot of people in the team that after 18 months to 2 years want to move on to something else, whether that be laterally or consider taking on a management or a leadership role. And certainly there are people that are the opposite of that as well, where they want to just do the one thing they do and do that one thing really well. But we found that a lot of people have a desire to grow and do new things. So when it comes to retention, I think it's important to have the anonymous survey so that we can identify what the themes are across the team. But then we encourage our managers to continue those one-on-one conversations with each of their employees because everyone's motivated by different things. And I think it's important to know what
Mm.
motivates each person. One person might be 100% motivated by money, and that's important to know versus somebody that, yeah, money's important to them, but if they get a call for 20, 30% more and these other intangibles aren't any better, they're not going to take the call. And so having that unique perspective where
Mm.
possible is really helpful.
Do you find that it's that financial services is competing with tech companies, with fintech companies? Like, is that challenging that it's, maybe not as well, at least the company may not seem as sexy. Whether the job is as sexy or not is different. But like with, younger people these days, like, are they motivated by having a big tech company name on their resume, or are they motivated more by a particular mission? Um, how do you compete with that kind of piece of it, where it's like what's sort of currently sexy? Not to say that MassMutual is
Yeah.
like the sexiest company in the world.
Insurance is super sexy. Yeah, I think we are starting to see more people explore other industries. And I think, again, back to what I said before, that being able to work remotely does also increase the movement and the ability to even span across different industries. Whereas some people that live in a particular area that MassMutual, for example, is based in Springfield, and that is really well known in Springfield. And so, if you grew up in Springfield, you know MassMutual and you appreciate that brand. And not that it's the only
Mm.
place that you can work, but it's certainly a well known company that you would aspire to work for. And now, with being
Mm.
more ability to be remote, people might have other aspirations and companies that might not have been on their immediate radar. The research that I did a couple of years ago when I was looking at what motivates millennials and Gen Z in terms of the companies had a lot of emphasis on social responsibility. So you mentioned, is it mission oriented? I think that is a huge part of it. I think a lot of the younger generations are looking at what is the not only the mission and the purpose of the company, but how does that particular company give back to society And I'm really proud of all the things that MassMutual does that I think a lot of people don't know about the company, and that they provide a lot of um, both financial as well as other ways of giving back to the local communities in Springfield and other parts of
Mm,
Massachusetts. There's an initiative where they have provided financial assistance and funding to Black owned businesses in the Massachusetts area. And things like that, I think, are just, you know, not core to what we do as a company, but core to who we are as a company. And I think those two things could be different. And so when you think about what is sexy about a company, maybe it's not necessarily just what the company offers in terms of services. It could be also, what does the company do with their influence and their power to give back to others?
yeah, that's interesting. All right, let's back up a little bit and talk about you. I'd like to hear more about, your journey to becoming a CISO. Like, did you always want to be in cybersecurity, or did you fall into it like many people do?
I would say a little bit of both. So when I went to college, cybersecurity degrees weren't yet a thing, but they did have in the engineering school a cybersecurity certificate program that was just starting to be developed. And I was actually a business major, but I was really intrigued by the certificate classes in the engineering school, so I did that. And it was just more because I thought it was something different, and I didn't really have a particular driver for taking those classes at the time. When I started my first job, I was in consulting and more on the data analytics side, and I wasn't that motivated by the initial work that I was doing. I knew some people that were working in the security practice at that consulting company, and they said they were looking for someone to join them on a 1 week project to do a penetration test at a company in Atlanta. And I'm a kind of fake it till you make it sort of person. So while didn't, I don't really think at the now looking back, I don't think I really had the right skills to do that project, but I somehow convinced the manager on that project to have me join them on this project, and so I went with them down to Atlanta and clearly did enough, the bare minimum enough to sell that I could kind of figure out what I was doing. And I just sort of fell in love with working in cybersecurity at that time. And so then I ended up switching into the cybersecurity group there, and then started just learning mostly hands on, and found some really great mentors that I was working with that invested time in teaching me. I ended up this this particular client, they had a longer term project there, so I ended up joining that longer term project. And every Friday there were a couple of people that were really gracious, and we would get on a whiteboard on Fridays in the afternoon before we'd head back to the airport. And there'd be a particular topic that they would teach me, and it would be a lesson of the day every Friday. And they really invested in me, and I really appreciated that they put the time into doing that. So that was year one of my career, and since then I've been in cybersecurity, and I did aspire to then someday be in the CISO role, and was really fortunate that last year that panned out for me.
Oh, congratulations. Um, it's interesting that you talk about how crucial mentorship is. Do you, that's, like, as you even said, like, the fact that people would invest in you like that is maybe not the normal, sort of not what happens all the time. Um, do you think that could be more, or like what could be done to provide more mentorship for junior people? I mean, I think that would also be a powerful retention tool if people
Absolutely.
really did that. I don't know if you're doing that like in any kind of formal way within your department, or what advice you could give CISOs and other senior managers about, how do you actually mentor people? Like, what's an effective way of doing it? Like this, like Whiteboard Fridays thing is like quite discreet. Um, which like appeals to me because I feel like it's something that people could actually take on and do. Whereas sometimes I think that when people say mentorship, it's kind of like amorphous and people don't really know what they should actually be doing to mentor younger people. So any thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, I do a lot of mentoring, and some of it's in the formal capacity and some of it's more informal, but I think it can take a wide variety of forms. It could be more on the career development side and, more of the kind of formal once a month conversation about what goals the person has, what their challenges are, and how do we work through those. Or it could be more on the hands-on side, like the whiteboard Fridays example. There's a couple of people in my team that work in our security operations center that are really passionate about teaching others and growing, and they're similar to me in that if they find someone that they think has that intellectual curiosity but maybe doesn't have all the knowledge, they will take them under their wing and spend a lot of time with them
Mm.
in their personal time in the off hours to train them. And our security operations center works shifts, so sometimes that means people that are working around the clock to work with someone else on a different shift to give them some training. And again, this is outside their formal responsibilities. They're not even asked to do this. This is something that they're passionate about. And so I do think that mentoring takes a wide variety of formats. It doesn't have to be just the traditional career conversation. I would say, I'm no longer in a place where I can probably mentor at a technical level, but I can certainly provide a lot of guidance and opinions and advice on um, career development and navigating certain situations. And so I do that through some programs at work and also some programs outside of MassMutual as well. And then lastly, I'm also in a reverse mentoring program at MassMutual that I find
Hmm.
incredibly powerful, where I'm the mentee and it's a pod based program. So I have two mentors and they're both junior, and they provide me with advice and guidance on situations that I'm navigating from their perspective, both from a different generation as well as from a different point in their career. And I think I learn more sometimes from them than I learn from more seasoned people because they bring just a totally different perspective to the table, as well as things that I might not be thinking about how my team feels about things that I'm doing. And it's been really amazing experience for me so far.
I love that. That I think is great, great idea. It like takes the whole, 360 review thing, but puts it at a much more kind of human and ongoing relationship level. I think that's awesome. That's done. So now that you are a CISO, what is your day like? What is a typical day for you?
I don't know that there's a typical day. I think every day is different, which is honestly what I love about it. There's always something new to read about and learn. I love learning, and so I'm really invested in staying on top of the latest threat intelligence. My team does a really nice job of curating a lot of meaningful information, but then I do some of my own research as well on the side, and that's what I find the most interesting about the job. So I do, I mean, maybe 10% of my day is invested in that and making sure that I'm up to date on the latest threat intelligence information. And then I would say a big chunk of my time is one-on-one time. So having those individual conversations, whether that be with my team, my direct reports, or my peers, or my stakeholders, maybe 50% of my day is actually invested in that. And
Mm.
I find that the most meaningful time that I have. Certainly, I have, the recurring meetings and other one off topics there as well. But I find the human part, especially being virtual and not seeing people day to day in the office, having the scheduled one on ones is really important for continuing that human relationship of our team.
How do you, when it comes to the actual sort of hands-on managing of the programs, um, how do you prioritize or think about balancing the kind of big upcoming trends, topics like 5D or Web 3.0 or quantum computing or digital assets, all that kind of stuff, with the bread and butter kind of everyday, phishing attacks and that kind of stuff that's just like the run of the mill business as usual. Is there like a weight of one versus the other? Is the big weight on sort of the low level stuff that you have to just kind of work through every day, or can you talk a little bit more about that?
This year, we developed a new risk quantification framework that I think has really helped us focus our time on where we want to invest in controls. So we let the landscape drive, what are the new areas that we want to focus on. We let the business priorities drive, what is important to us to focus on. For example, if we're starting to dabble in the crypto space, then we need to ensure that we are increasing our own cybersecurity knowledge about cryptocurrency. If we're not, then it's kind of interesting, but we don't necessarily have to put our time into that. On the same front, just staying on top of what's happening in the external threat landscape, and especially what is targeting financial services and the insurance sector specifically, helps us pinpoint where to
Mm.
focus our time. And so I think both are important. Over time, we've developed a really solid foundation for the basic controls that address the kind of day to day threats that don't evolve as much. But then we recognize that I mean, even phishing attacks have evolved significantly. So it's not like you can implement a control and then just assume it's going to keep operating effectively. You have to continuously tune it and understand what the new techniques that are being used. And so I think it's a continuous circle of evolving what we already have in place, keeping an eye towards the future, but not getting distracted. So there's a lot of new innovative technology out there, and I think it's important to know a little bit about it, but not get distracted by some of the shiny objects that aren't relevant to us today.
One of the things that we talked about when you did a piece for our Insights thought leadership platform was about supply chain resiliency. And since the last time we spoke, I just wanted to know, like, has your thinking evolved on that at all? Have you seen that the industry has evolved on that? Because obviously, supply chain risk and third party risk is just, steep curve up. Um, are you seeing that there's more focus now on this idea of actually being resilient and being able to not be so reliant on on any one supplier to the point where that could actually break you?
I think so. I think the first step is just more visibility and understanding of the problem statement. And that's not just within the cybersecurity team, but that's for the business. Because I think a lot of times the executives and of the business areas think that the cybersecurity team is responsible for all cyber related things, right? So if a cyber event happens at a third party, it's still somehow the cybersecurity team's job to, mitigate it. And we've started to raise more awareness of the concept of a cyber event can result in business resiliency challenges. And so I feel like the industry is starting to identify the need for creating business resiliency roles where the cyber organization is influencing the areas where the knowledge needs to be increased and where we need to have better contingency plans. And that's why things like tabletops are really important for, what would you do in the event that this particular supplier is not available. And so I do think that there's more focus on it, but I don't think it's quite solved yet. I think there's every day more and more third parties that you read about that are impacted. And a lot of times it's hard to even pick out from what you read in the news about where the actual incident occurred because there are so many components of the ecosystem for companies where they're using third and fourth parties. I think the reputational impact to the impacted company is the most important part, and they may not have actually even been responsible for the incident.
Yeah.
There was a bank, I think it was last month, that an incident occurred at one of their key service providers, and the data was compromised there, and the service provider was servicing them. And all the news articles, when you read them, seem like this particular bank was the one that had the incident occur there. And it's not until you get to almost the end of the articles where you understand that actually this incident occurred at their service provider, but the reputational impact is to the bank, and that's the one in the headlines. And I think that's what companies are starting to wake up to realize, is that we can't control the reputational impacts within our four walls anymore.
We talked a little bit about it in the article, and I can direct people to that. But you know, given the depth and the complexity of the supply chain, especially software supply chain, how do you begin to even think about at the high level, not at the like detailed level, but at the high level, how do you begin to think about, well, okay, my reputation is dependent on all of these other suppliers that I have zero control over. Like, how do I manage that?
I think there's layered controls, and then there's also a risk cost benefit to weigh, right? So somebody recently asked me, if we're starting to see all these third party incidents, then why don't companies start to just bring more things in house and not outsource or leverage third parties to provide these critical services? And I said, just it's still ultimately a cost benefit decision where the likelihood of this happening is still less than the cost to bring all these things in house. And I
Right.
made up an analogy that I don't know is super great, but I'll try it anyway, which is that some mosquitoes carry disease, and if you go outside, you might get bit by a mosquito that's carrying a disease, but you're not going to not go outside just because maybe one in a million mosquitoes are carrying that disease. You do things to mitigate against that. You wear bug spray, maybe you wear longer pants, you put the citronella candles out. You do these things, and it's not going to prevent this from happening 100%, but you're likely not going to not go outside because of that. And I think about that similarly with this case, where
Mm,
you can't bring everything in house. It's just not cost effective. So I think we just have
no,
to.
not every company is going to build an AWS.
Exactly. So I think you
Right.
have to just you ultimately have to weigh that cost with the benefits and the likelihood of it happening, and you just have to have good playbooks for what happens if and when what you do if and when that happens.
You mentioned before that you're focused on, which I think is healthy, and I'm sure most CISOs of larger firms are doing this by now, but prioritizing what you focus on based on what the business is prioritizing. Um, do you see that? Do you think that that is like standard across financial services now, or do you still think that potentially there's a lot of cybersecurity teams that are kind of operating in a more technical, not necessarily connecting what they do to what the business needs are, and if so, especially with CISOs who don't come from business backgrounds but come from more technical backgrounds, what advice would you give them to start connecting into what the business needs in order to help drive their priorities?
I think that you can't have zero risk, and so it similar to the discussion around third parties and supply chain, there's still a reasonable amount of cyber risk that you can and should take in order for the business to operate and be profitable and explore new opportunities. And so I think that companies that operate as a more in a more black and white area where the cybersecurity team is more of that kind of no based organization where they're the ones that are telling the business, no, you can't do that or you have to do it this way, are the ones where they don't have as much collaboration and partnership and support. And that's where you get into the kind of blame game where then it's not a partnership, and if you don't prevent the incident, you're blamed for not preventing the incident, and if your controls maybe have a business impact because it's some sort of false positive, then you're blamed for impacting the business. To not have that type of relationship, it's important to meet the business where they are and ultimately make some risk decisions where you have to agree to um, certain situations that there is some risk to it, but if you choose not to agree to that, the business won't be able to release that new product that is going to be profitable for the company or explore this new venture. And so I think that coming to the table as a partner, being collaborative, willing to compromise, I think goes a long way and creates that partnership so that you're no longer the team that gets blamed for everything.
Yeah. Is that also where, I mean, you talked about quantifying risk, and my understanding is that, there's increasingly, there's more quantifying risk kind of frameworks out there and stuff, but historically, cybersecurity has found it difficult to quantify risks. And so it's a lot of, red, amber, green, and not kind of discrete. Does that help when you have a framework for quantifying risk? I would imagine that you can then, when you're putting dollars against dollars, then that can help you speak the same language as the business side of the house.
Yes and no. So when I'm talking now about quantifying risk, it's actually not in dollars. That's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, actually, where I don't think you can effectively quantify cyber risk in dollars because there's so much of the intangibles, like the reputational impact, and it's not just about how much would it cost to rebuild the network or how much would it cost if we um, lost these records. Some of that you can certainly quantify in dollars, but there's so much outside of that that is the
Mm.
intangible. So our quantification is more in context of each other. So it's on a scale of 1 to 5, and the number itself is actually not that important. What's important is how this risk relates to this risk, which of them is higher, and that helps us drive where we put our focus. So if there's more risk in risk A, then that's the one that we're going to allocate the additional headcount to or the additional software budget to. And so I try to stay away from quantifying risk in dollars. Certainly, some people find that an effective method for demonstrating the business value that they bring. You can say, well, it's a good deal if you give me X number of dollars to protect the company because the potential impact is Y. But I just choose not to do that.
Does that present any challenges, or like in terms of talking to the board, or do you find that, or even, other C-level executives who you're working with, or do you find that I guess, like, the way that you present it, um, is clear enough that they can incorporate that into their own, risk assessments and things like that?
Yeah, I find that the way that we're doing it to be effective because it ultimately gives us the answer to what are the things that we should be worried about. And it does give us a framework so that we can demonstrate that we haven't just made up that these are the things that are important, which sometimes is where you start a program. You just kind of write on a piece of paper, here are the things that we think are need the most attention, but that kind of evolves over time. And so having a framework and a way to quantify it, I think just gives some substance to the board and the executive team to agree that yes, there's some methodology in how you've arrived at these are the most important things for you to focus on. So I think it's about having something consistent to go back to, and then being able to do trending over time where the trending doesn't change. So I think it can be hard where you're creating new models and approaches year over year, and then it's hard for the board to see, well, how do we compare to last year? Because now you're doing it a different way. And so creating a framework that hopefully sticks for some time is helpful to show consistency year over year.
Do you still see from where you sit that boards and senior level executives consider cybersecurity to be more of a cost or like a back office thing, or given the prominence that cyber now has us on the front pages of every newspaper, et cetera, that now has translated into boards seeing it as an area of critical business risk and prioritizing and investing in it accordingly?
I think it does depend on the size and maturity of the company, but I do think it's more of the latter than the former now. I think, especially because you can't go usually a day without reading about a new kind of cyber incident in the news or a new type of attack or technique. I think it's just more commonplace now, where 10 years ago, when I told someone I worked in information security at the time, you really understood what that meant. And now I think people, for the most part, understand what what cybersecurity is and why it's important. And so I think in some ways the focus in the news on the impacts is helpful in bringing broader awareness. At the same time, I do think it can be distracting for companies and boards where there's not necessarily always a focus on the most relevant attacks or considerations for a company, but at least we're heading in the right direction where we have more awareness more broadly.
Are you seeing more cybersecurity expertise on boards?
Well, I think we're going to see that, especially because there's some new draft regulation out there for, especially for public companies, to start disclosing the cybersecurity experience of their board members. It's not yet a requirement,
Mm.
but I think that's probably going to be the next step where I imagine in the future, public companies at least will be required to have at least one person on their board. That's my personal opinion.
Good opportunity for CISOs.
Absolutely.
Maybe you'll see more CISOs on other corporate boards. Um, what are the major industry trends that you see coming up that you are focused on making sure that you know about and get ahead of?
Well, supply chain obviously is a key trend that we're continuing to track. But I think there's some new techniques that are being used, particularly in a combination of phishing attacks using business email compromise as kind of the entry point into that. We're seeing a lot of chaining of compromised emails through BEC attacks that are then used to weaponize phishing, where there's new innovative controls that look at not only the content of an email when determining if the email is a phishing email, but also looking at, is this a sender receiver pair that is expected? Has this person received email
Mm.
from this person before? But if that email has been compromised, that's hard to detect. So I feel like we're always one step behind, the threat actors of being able to address the most recent techniques that are being used, and so that won't change. But I think that maybe over the last couple of years, we were starting to get a little bit more comfortable in the phishing email space, where some of the new tools that had come out were giving a better protection over the emails arriving. Also, we've been doing a good job as an industry to better educate our employees about spotting a phishing email, especially because for so
Mm.
long it was, a lot of the tells in the email were quite obvious to pick out, and now we're seeing a lot of the emails be really legitimate looking. And I sometimes worry, that that even I could fall for a phishing email, and especially in a simulated um, phishing campaign. That's like the running joke of, when we do the simulated phishing awareness campaigns, you never want to be the one in the team that falls for it, right? So I think that's
You
the
definitely don't want to be
no,
that
you
one.
don't want to be that person. But I think that's where we're starting to see some new techniques being used, and chaining together multiple techniques together.
When you say chaining, can you just like can you give me examples of what that means?
Yeah, so chaining in the context of a compromised email. So you compromise one email, and then you're not necessarily doing anything malicious in that email other than using it to then reach out to the recipients of that email. And so a lot of times attacks are very opportunistic in that threat actors are just looking for the weakest link that they can find, and they may have an ultimate target, but that might not be the first um, in the chain, right? So that's why supply chain attacks are so impactful, because they can be rather opportunistic in that you can hit a wide range of unintended and indirect victims based on an initial compromise. So chaining, just in that you use one compromised email to then compromise the next, and so on.
That's it's scary, right? I mean, just how good they are, right? How good the emails are and how real they seem. And if even a CISO could fall for it, it's what does that say about your average, distracted, busy customer? Um, I don't know how you deal with it. We talk a lot about cyber hygiene, and I find that I would like to try to find a better way of talking about it that makes it not sound so like mommy says brush your teeth kind of thing. Like, how do you do you make like obviously there's you know fake phishing emails and things that you do to test your staff and do some education and whatever, but is there any way that you can think of where you kind of can inspire people to want to protect, and be vigilant as opposed to kind of dragging people along and making them?
Well, the social engineering aspect of cybersecurity in general, I think, is always going to be the weakest link, because we can only we can only do so much from a technical controls standpoint to get us to 90%. And then, in the example of phishing, you can't prevent every phishing email from entering the user's inbox. You can't prevent someone from calling someone and them scamming them into doing something. There's just so many vectors there. So I think incentivizing, to your question, is the only way to make people feel like they have the ability to do something positive when it comes to their role in
Yeah.
defending. It's kind of like the if you see something, say something mentality, right? So it is a good practice to incentivize someone when they report, a phishing email, whether it be an actual phishing email or not. Sometimes gamification of learning about cybersecurity can be a really good way to make cybersecurity not seem so intimidating or so scary, and to create educational opportunities for people to learn about how to protect themselves and how to protect others, but using fun games to incentivize them. Versus, to your point, just making someone feel bad because they clicked the phishing link. A lot of times with phishing programs, if you click the phishing link maybe more than once, then you get your wrist slapped, and then you have to go take a training, right? Because you're considered now a
Yeah.
repeat offender. And I think that's important, because clearly there's a trend there, but maybe we're de-incentivizing someone by making them feel bad versus recognizing that these can be quite difficult to detect, and the human interaction is important. And so in our case, we leverage our business information security officers, our BISOs, to reach out individually to people that may have fallen victim multiple times to a phishing campaign and have a personal conversation about it rather than send them the nasty gram email and just require them to go take training.
It just, I had thought of something that somebody mentioned recently when I was at the Europe Summit in Madrid about like just, I guess the word they were using was deception. So like almost being offensive and trying to deceive threat actors when they are in your environment. Is that something that you're seeing as a growing trend?
There's a whole category of deceptive technology, and it's interesting, but for me, it's just not the most important thing to focus on. So, if and when
Mm.
we address all of the the other areas that I think are top priorities, maybe we'd come around to deception. But that's just in a world where there's unlimited resources. I think it's a cool thing to do, but you ultimately have to prioritize what you focus on.
Another thing that came up that I thought was interesting was there was a whole panel about mental health and the burnout that cybersecurity teams have felt over the last couple of years, especially with going to remote and all the different challenges that that has brought. Um, do you have any advice or what helps you stay motivated and balanced that you could kind of give to people who are feeling a bit burned out?
I think probably leaning in to recognizing that you are burnt out. So everyone has things going on outside of their day job. So I have two small children. I'm currently moving. I have a lot that's going on personally that is impacting me even during the day, whether I want to admit it or not, right? It's hard to separate who I am at night versus who I am during the day, right? So I think that people, and maybe women specifically, if I could just stereotype and generalize for a minute, try to put on this facade that we've got it all together all the time. And I think it's okay to just sometimes admit that just don't have it all together right now, right? That you're just kind of not killing it at anything. Like I always say, like sometimes I feel like I'm killing it at everything. Like I'm just an awesome mom and I'm an awesome CISO and everything is great. And then I feel like I'm some days failing at all the things. And I think just admitting that is kind of the key to not getting burnt out, which is giving yourself some space to recognize that there are days where maybe you take the afternoon off and you just kind of do something around the house or do something with your kids or take a walk. I don't know, but I think just trying to not pretend like you have it all together all the time is key to that, or you will be burnt out eventually.
I can relate to that. Um, okay, on final note, do you have any specific people or organizations or efforts that are going on right now in FinCyber that you admire, that you'd like to raise awareness about or point other people to know about? Could be anything.
Well, I'm pretty jealous of companies that are earlier in their the company itself is a newer company and it's grown up more in the fintech space where it's more cloud native and some of the practices are a bit more forward looking and it's easier to embed security into the day to day when you're kind of built out of more of a DevOps mindset to begin with versus working at a
Mm.
170-year-old company where you have 170 years of business and business processes and hopefully not technology that's 170 years old, but you know what I mean. And so I'm very interested to learn from companies that have figured out a way to merge the two together. And so I guess more of a plea to anyone listening that if you've been successful in taking an older company that has a lot of the legacy infrastructure, but bringing that more fintech um, mindset to the table, that's somebody that I would definitely admire and love to chat with more. But I don't have anyone specifically that comes to mind, and so that's the magic person
That's
that
the
I'm looking
challenge.
for.
If you're out there, You can get in touch with Ariel. Okay. Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Based on our conversation, I'll leave you with a quote on talent development and mentorship from none other than Steven Spielberg. The delicate balance of mentoring someone is not creating them in your own image, but giving them the opportunity to create themselves. If you like this podcast and want to hear more from FinCyber leaders around the world, subscribe to FinCyber Today on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find them as well as articles by other thought leaders at FS-ISAC.com/insights and also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much for listening.